The flight attendant didn't whisper. She pointed straight at him, voice slicing through the air like a blade. "You need to move. Now!" Passengers looked up. Whispers spread. In 4C sat a tall black man in a plain shirt and jeans, saying nothing. Not because he was wrong, but because he'd seen this before. Too many times. What no one realized. That man designed the seat he was being kicked out of, and the airline, and the rules. And in the next 30 minutes, the woman barking orders would wish she'd never opened her mouth, because this flight wasn't going anywhere. Julian Cross boarded flight GW417 with nothing but a leather satchel and a calm, measured stride. No suit, no assistants, no gold watch. Just a quiet presence wrapped in dark denim and a slate-gray sweater. As he stepped into the business class cabin, he nodded politely at a seated passenger, then reached into the overhead bin. That's when the voice rang out. "You can't be here," said the flight attendant sharply. Heads turned. Karen Blake stood 2 rows ahead, hand raised and finger pointed like a judge issuing a sentence. "Sir, this is business class. I'll need you to return to your assigned seat in economy. Now!" She didn't whisper. She didn't approach. She made a declaration, public, loud, and aimed like a dart. Her expression wasn't concerned. It was contemptuous, the kind reserved for people you believe don't belong. Julian looked at her. He didn't speak. The cabin fell into a hush, the kind of awkward silence that swells in the wake of visible discomfort. A man in 3A lowered his newspaper. A young woman beside him shifted her gaze, unsure whether to watch or pretend not to notice. Karen took a step forward. "Sir," she said again, more forcefully, "if you don't move, I'll have to call security." No one said a word. Julian slowly closed the overhead bin, adjusted the strap on his satchel, and without argument, walked back down the aisle. One row, then another. His shoulders were straight, his face blank, but every step echoed louder than the last. Not because he was wrong, but because he chose not to fight. In 22D, by the engine hum and the scent of stale air, he sat down, pulled a novel from his bag, and opened it. Page 1. Not because he planned to read, but because the act of opening that book was its own kind of resistance. Behind him, whispers floated like smoke. "What just happened?" someone muttered. "Was that guy trying to sneak into business class?" He didn't even argue. Weird. Julian didn't flinch. He had expected something. He hadn't expected this much, this fast. But still, he had work to do. At the front of the plane, Karen returned to her post with a smirk only she could see. To her, the matter was closed, handled, controlled. But the plane hadn't even left the gate. And what she didn't know, what no one knew, was that the man she had just humiliated, in front of 30 watching eyes, wasn't some lost traveler or mistaken passenger. He was the one person who could bring the entire flight, and perhaps her career, to a full, immediate stop. And he wouldn't need to raise his voice to do it. To the rest of the passengers, Julian Cross looked like a man who had been publicly put in his place. A quiet, older gentleman who didn't speak up, didn't protest, and didn't even try to defend his right to sit in a premium cabin. To them, he was either ashamed, embarrassed, or simply resigned. But they were wrong. Julian Cross wasn't humiliated. He was observing, and he had seen enough. From his window seat in 22D, Julian pulled his phone from his pocket and typed 6 words into a secure app only 3 people in the company had access to. Indigo, Gate 17, Escalate. He hit send, then closed his phone. Julian was no ordinary passenger. He was the founder, majority shareholder, and current CEO of Global Wings, the very airline on which he'd just been dismissed like an intruder. His fingerprints were on the layout of the cabins, the customer service protocol, even the material of the business class seat cushions. Every decision made by this airline in the last 15 years had his name buried somewhere in its chain of command. But none of that mattered now, because Julian wasn't here to flex power. He was here to test culture. Over the past year, a troubling pattern had emerged. Emails from passengers describing dismissive treatment, strange reassignment incidents, uncomfortable boarding experiences that seemed to follow a particular, unsettling theme. Not loud racism, not explicit threats, but microaggressions wrapped in policy, glances laced with doubt, rules enforced differently depending on who you were and how you looked. Julian had read every complaint. He hadn't passed them down to PR or legal. He'd printed them, highlighted them, taken notes in the margins, and then he'd booked this flight himself, under a different variation of his name. No red flags, no special treatment, just a test, to see if the rot he sensed in policy had made its way into people. He hadn't expected it to happen so fast. He hadn't expected it to happen this blatantly. But that was the thing about bias. It rarely waited for convenience. Karen Blake had confirmed his worst fears in under 3 minutes of boarding. She had scanned his face, his clothes, and made a snap judgment that didn't just violate ethics. It violated the very training she had likely signed off on years ago. Julian didn't feel angry. He felt ready. At Gate 17, something had already begun to move. Because indigo wasn't just a word. It was a protocol, one that signaled a silent alert to key operational leaders. The message meant, escalate now, but stay quiet. CEO is on board. And in less than 20 minutes, that message would reach someone who could stop the flight, reassign the crew, and turn this simple test into a corporate reckoning. Julian looked out the window. Not angry, not flustered, just focused. Gregory Stone had the kind of presence that drew assumptions. Mid-50s, crisp tailored blazer, salt and pepper hair slicked back with precision. He sat in 1B, legs crossed, sipping sparkling water like someone used to control, used to comfort. When the incident with Julian unfolded, he didn't flinch. He didn't lean in. He didn't raise his voice in protest. And that silence said everything. At least, that's what the other passengers thought. A woman in 2A glanced at him, expecting to see smug approval. Instead, she saw a tight jaw and eyes that hadn't moved from Julian's seat, even after he walked away. Gregory wasn't indifferent. He was watching and remembering. 25 years ago, Gregory had been a commercial pilot. Young, ambitious, eager to do everything right. He'd flown regional jets, then international. He was good, too good to be dismissed easily. But after raising concerns about unfair crew assignments and racially coded language on intercom logs, he found himself quietly pushed out of rotation. No official demotion, just fewer flight hours, less trust. A sudden whisper campaign that he was uncooperative. Eventually, he left. Now, decades later, sitting in seat 1B, watching history repeat, he couldn't stay silent. He waited until Karen passed toward the galley, then leaned slightly into the aisle. Naomi Chen, the junior attendant who'd been shadowing Karen, stood nearby. She looked young, observant, nervous. The kind of nervous that meant she knew something wasn't right but didn't know what to do with it. Gregory's voice was low, calm, but carried weight. "You might want to double-check the manifest," he said. Naomi blinked. "I'm sorry?" "The man who was asked to move," Gregory said, nodding subtly toward the back. He didn't argue, didn't posture. People like that don't back down because they're afraid. They back down because they're calculating. Naomi looked startled. "Sir, Just check," Gregory said. "Trust me." He leaned back, sipped his water again, and said nothing more. Naomi hesitated for a beat, then turned and made her way to the jump seat console. Her fingers moved across the tablet manifest, scanning the passenger list. Her brow furrowed. Full fare. No upgrade. Name matched. Nothing suspicious. She glanced toward the back of the cabin. Something about it didn't add up. She stood still for a moment, caught between instinct and authority, between what she was seeing and what she had been taught not to question. Gregory, watching her from row 1, nodded once to himself. The man in 4C wasn't just another passenger. And this flight? It was about to become something much more than a trip from LA to Chicago. Naomi Chen stood just beyond the galley curtain, tablet in hand, heart pounding harder with every swipe of her finger. She double-checked the manifest, then triple-checked. Seat 4C, Julian Cross, business class, full fare, no upgrade, no errors, no ambiguity. He had every right to sit there. She looked again, searching for some technicality, some explanation that would justify what Karen had done. But there was none. The booking ID was clear. The fare code was premium. The timestamp showed the purchase was made directly through the executive portal. Unusual, but not unheard of. And then there was the last name, Cross. Something about it buzzed in her mind. She tapped the crew directory. There were only a few dozen executives authorized to book through the portal with override codes. One of them, Julian Cross, CEO, Global Wings. Naomi's breath caught in her throat. She looked up slowly, the reality crashing into her like turbulence at 40,000 feet. The man Karen had dismissed so casually, so publicly, wasn't just a paying customer. He was the head of the entire airline. She steadied herself, tucked the tablet against her hip, and moved quickly toward the front. Karen was by the coffee service, fixing her lipstick in the reflection of the metallic galley wall. She turned as Naomi approached, raising an eyebrow. "Well?" she asked. Naomi swallowed. "He's full fare, seat 4C, not an upgrade. Everything checks out." Karen didn't flinch. She didn't apologize. She smiled. "Oh, honey," she said, voice syrupy but sharp. "You're new. Let me give you a bit of advice." She stepped closer, dropping her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "I don't care what that manifest says. Some people look like they're trying too hard to belong. That alone is reason enough to question." Naomi stared at her, stunned. Karen's smile widened. "And besides," she added with a wink, "even if he complains, I'll be fine. My sister's husband is on the board. You think they'll fire me over some awkward misunderstanding?" Naomi's stomach turned. "You should be careful, though," Karen continued, now adjusting the cuffs on her uniform. "People who cause trouble early in their career don't tend to last long." She winked again, then turned away. Naomi stood frozen. It wasn't just arrogance. It was insulation. Karen didn't fear consequences because she believed she was above them. And now Naomi had a choice. Say nothing and survive, or speak up and risk everything. As she looked down the aisle toward Julian's seat in the back, where he sat still and silent, Naomi felt something shift inside her. Because knowing the truth changes you. And once you see the rot, you can't unsee it. Julian Cross rose from seat 22D with the same quiet grace he'd maintained since boarding. No dramatic gestures, no glances over his shoulder. Just calm, deliberate motion as he placed the unopened book into his leather satchel and stepped into the aisle. Passengers glanced up, unsure if he was finally going to make a scene. But he said nothing. He moved forward, past rows of whispered judgments and stolen glances, and disappeared into the forward galley. The jet bridge door creaked open. Waiting just beyond it stood Elliot Graves, Vice President of Operations, in a dark tailored suit and an expression that flickered between concern and confusion. He'd received the Indigo code alert 12 minutes ago. Julian's encrypted message had bypassed protocol and gone straight to the top of his priority queue. He hadn't even asked questions. He'd gotten in the car. Now, seeing Julian standing before him, he understood the weight of the situation. Julian gestured for him to follow. They stepped into the quiet of the jet bridge, sealed off from cabin noise and passenger eyes. Julian's voice was low, firm. "We're in the final stage of a $1.2 billion merger. Board confidence is already fragile." Elliot nodded grimly. "If this leaks before we act," Julian continued, "I won't just be embarrassed. I'll be expendable." Elliot's jaw clenched. "Then let's handle it. Quietly, quickly." Julian shook his head. "Not quickly, not quietly, correctly." A beat of silence passed. Then Julian added, We don't just have a rogue employee. We have a culture crack. If we patch it with silence, it'll split again under pressure. Elliot exhaled slowly. So, what's the move? Julian glanced back toward the cabin. I'm going to walk in like nothing happened. You'll follow in 5 minutes with 2 airport supervisors. No security, no noise. But I want eyes on everyone, especially Karen Blake, and I want it logged. Elliot nodded. Understood. Julian's tone softened, but sharpened. Elliot, if this goes sideways, the board won't just question Karen's behavior. They'll question mine. They already think I'm too soft on internal reform. You've pushed for more than anyone, Elliot said, almost defensively. Julian met his gaze. Not enough, or this wouldn't have happened. With that, he turned and re-entered the aircraft. No announcement, no drama. Just Julian Cross, walking slowly back down the aisle toward his original seat in 4C like nothing had ever occurred. But everything had changed. And behind him, on the tarmac, a chain reaction had begun. Inside Global Wings HQ, a string of silent pings lit up private dashboards. Indigo Protocol was in motion. Live tracking, live audio. Internal communications under surveillance, nothing visible to passengers. But everything inside the system was watching now. Julian sat, opened his book again, and waited. The cabin of Flight GW417 had gone still, not with peace, but with pressure. Julian sat again in seat 4C, posture relaxed, but energy coiled like a spring. Naomi hovered near the galley, eyes flicking between the manifest and Karen. Karen, for her part, stood rigid against the galley wall, arms crossed tightly, lips pressed into a line. Her confidence from earlier had cracked, but not yet collapsed. Then the forward door opened again. Elliot Graves stepped aboard, flanked by 2 airport supervisors in plain clothes and clipped badges. He moved with a calm assertiveness, the kind that says, "This isn't an emergency, but it could become one fast." He nodded to the cabin crew, then raised his voice just enough to carry through the aisles. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We've had a procedural delay, but everything is being resolved. We appreciate your understanding." Polite, professional, deceptively mild. But Karen heard the subtext. She took a step away from the wall, forcing a smile. "Mr. Graves." He didn't look at her. Instead, he scanned the rows until he saw Julian in 4C, then gave a small, respectful nod. Naomi watched closely. So did the passengers nearby. And then, unexpectedly, someone else stood. From seat 1B, Gregory Stone rose slowly, clearing his throat. "I wasn't going to speak," he said, his voice steady but layered with weight. "But maybe it's time." Passengers turned. Even Karen froze. "I used to work for this airline," Gregory continued. "I was a pilot. For 17 years, I raised concerns, not complaints, concerns. About treatment, about bias, about crew dynamics. I did it the right way, through the right channels. And 2 months later, my hours were cut in half. A year later, I was pushed out." No one moved. Gregory looked straight at Karen, then down the aisle toward Julian. "I've kept quiet a long time. Thought maybe it was just me. Thought maybe silence was safer. But today, the man sitting in 4C reminded me that silence is a choice. And sometimes it's the wrong one." A murmur rippled through the rows. Julian didn't speak. He didn't even look up. But the shift was undeniable. Karen's smirk had vanished. Her arms had dropped to her sides. Even Naomi took a step back, as if giving space to whatever was unfolding. Gregory returned to his seat without flourish, but his words stayed. Long after, passengers began whispering, not with suspicion but with realization, that something bigger was happening, that the man in 4C wasn't just part of the story. He was the reason it was being rewritten. Karen stood motionless, her authority evaporating one breath at a time. Because in that cabin, the power had shifted, and everyone could feel it. The silence after Gregory's revelation was dense, charged. Karen Blake stood rooted by the galley wall, her eyes darting between faces that no longer looked away. The smug assurance she wore earlier had drained from her like color from a fading photograph. Julian Cross remained in seat 4C, fingers gently resting on the open pages of his book. He hadn't turned a page since sitting back down. He hadn't needed to, because the entire plane had just turned toward him. Elliot Graves took 2 slow steps into the cabin, then faced Julian, voice low but deliberate. "Would you like to address the cabin, sir?" Julian didn't stand. He simply looked up and spoke with calm clarity. "My name is Julian Cross. I'm the founder and current CEO of Global Wings Airlines." Gasps swept through the rows like a breeze before a storm. Karen's mouth parted, but no sound came. Julian continued, still seated. "I boarded this flight as a silent observer to better understand the culture we've created, or allowed to fester, within our cabins. I didn't wear a suit. I didn't use my title. I didn't ask for recognition." He turned his gaze briefly to Naomi, then back to the cabin. "I asked only for the same respect afforded to any paying passenger." No one spoke. No one moved. Karen took a half step forward. I wasn't aware." Julian's voice didn't rise, but it sharpened. "That's the point. Respect shouldn't depend on recognition." Elliot, standing beside him, turned to Karen. His tone was neutral, professional, but final. "Ms. Blake, as of this moment, you are relieved of in-flight duties pending a full internal investigation. Please remain in the galley until we reach the gate." Karen's composure shattered. She opened her mouth to object, but caught the eyes watching her. Passengers, Naomi, crew. Even the man who had once sat silently in the back now commanded the whole aircraft without standing. Her shoulders dropped. She nodded once, retreated behind the curtain. Julian finally closed his book. Up front, the intercom crackled, and the calm voice of Captain Reynolds came through. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. On behalf of Global Wings, I'd like to sincerely apologize for any confusion or discomfort caused during today's boarding process. We are committed to upholding dignity and fairness for all our passengers. Thank you for your understanding." Soft murmurs followed. Some passengers nodded. Others let out quiet exhales, the kind that released tension held too long. In 4C, Julian didn't smile, but his eyes softened. Justice hadn't shouted. It had whispered and been heard. And for the first time since takeoff was delayed, the cabin finally felt still, not from fear, but from respect. As the last echoes of the captain's apology faded from the speakers, the cabin remained suspended in a rare, reverent silence. No tray tables clicked, no zippers opened. Even the hum of the engine seemed subdued, as if the entire aircraft had collectively leaned inward. Julian Cross sat quietly, his hands folded on top of his book. Then, from the galley, a small sound broke the silence, a stifled sob. Naomi Chen stepped out slowly, wiping her face with the corner of her sleeve. Her composure, so carefully held since boarding, had finally unraveled. Her eyes were glassy, her voice soft. I'm sorry," she said, looking directly at Julian. "I should have said something sooner. I saw what was happening and I froze. I thought if I stayed quiet, I could stay safe." Julian didn't blink. He simply nodded, his voice steady but kind. Silence is natural when the system teaches you that speaking has consequences. But today, you didn't stay silent. You looked closer. You stepped forward. Naomi's shoulders trembled. "I was afraid of Karen," she admitted. "She always made people feel like speaking up would get them benched, or worse." Julian's voice dropped even softer, almost fatherly. "I know, and still, you chose right. That's what matters." Naomi bowed her head slightly, not out of guilt, but gratitude. It wasn't just relief, it was release. From the front row, Gregory Stone cleared his throat again. Not to take over the moment, but to add to it. "I've flown thousands of hours," he said. "I've seen things swept under the rug more times than I can count. But today," he paused. Today, I saw something I haven't felt in years. He turned toward Julian. Hope. Julian met his gaze with a nod. And then, something unexpected happened. Someone in row 3 began clapping. Just once. Twice. Then more hands joined. Tentative at first, then stronger. It wasn't loud. It wasn't performative. But it was real. A woman in 2A whispered to her seatmate, This feels important." The applause grew, not in volume, but in sincerity. Naomi wiped her cheeks again, her expression half embarrassed, half empowered. Julian didn't rise to accept it. He didn't need to, because the recognition wasn't just for him. It was for all the people who had stayed quiet too long, for those who'd felt powerless in the presence of hierarchy, for the ones who were told to just do your job, even when it hurt. And now, in this pressurized cabin at cruising altitude, something lighter began to settle over the passengers. Not celebration, not closure, but clarity. This wasn't just about righting a wrong. It was about what happened next. Even before flight GW417 touched down in Chicago, ripples had already begun to spread across Global Wing's corporate headquarters. The Indigo Alert had triggered not just a response team, but a chain of silent observers. Legal, HR, executive ops, all watching in real time through internal channels. One junior analyst, seated at the gate during boarding, had discreetly recorded Karen's confrontation with Julian. He didn't know who Julian was at the time. He just knew what he was seeing wasn't right. The short clip, under 30 seconds, made its way onto the company's internal Slack, posted anonymously. Within an hour, it had been viewed by over 200 employees, and the board had seen it too. In a corner office on the top floor, Julian Cross ended a secure video call with Elliot Graves and set his phone down. He didn't pace. He didn't rant. He opened his leather notebook and turned to a blank page, Skyline Protocol. He wrote the title in block letters and began listing, line by line. Mandatory equity and ethics training for all flight and ground staff, renewed semi-annually. Anonymous reporting platform for incidents of bias or misconduct, immediate launch. 60-day cabin audit, including manifest logs, crew assignments, and passenger complaints across all domestic routes. Third-party review of termination and promotion trends within in-flight staff. Public commitment statement from Global Wing's leadership within 48 hours. Karen Blake. Immediate suspension pending investigation. Naomi Chen. Internal commendation and interview for potential leadership mentorship track. Gregory Stone. Offer consulting role for culture training reform. He paused, then added one more. CEO accountability review, by request. Julian signed the bottom. No one else needed to. Moments later, his assistant delivered copies of the protocol draft to the board, who were already assembling for an emergency session. Voices were raised. Some believed Julian had acted impulsively. Others argued he had been too slow. A few wondered aloud if the incident had been orchestrated, but none of them could ignore the facts. The CEO had been mistaken for someone who didn't belong by his own crew, and that alone meant something was broken, badly. Voting was scheduled within hours. 2 board members quietly called their assistants to dig up internal complaints buried months ago. Another asked for the analytics on crew demographics versus customer escalations. Julian didn't attend the first session. He didn't need to, because this wasn't just about Karen Blake anymore. It was about the system that let her feel untouchable. And Julian Cross wasn't going to patch a crack. He was going to tear the rot out at the root and rebuild from there. After the plane began taxiing toward the gate, the weight inside the cabin hadn't lifted. It had shifted. Not heavy like shame, not light like relief, but dense, like something true finally being spoken aloud. Karen Blake remained in the galley, silent and rigid. She had received the official request, a formal apology to the cabin, a gesture of accountability. But she declined, not with an outburst, not with tears, just a blank stare and a clipped, "No comment." Julian didn't push. He simply returned to his seat, unbothered. When Elliot Graves quietly informed him of Karen's refusal, Julian looked out the window, then replied, "Sometimes silence from the guilty says more than their words ever could." He let it hang there. Naomi, now standing near the forward jump seat, was fidgeting with the hem of her sleeve. Julian glanced toward her, then rose slowly and addressed the cabin. Not through the intercom, not with a speech, but with a gesture. He stepped into the aisle, turned slightly, and spoke just loud enough for the passengers in the front half to hear. "Ms. Naomi Chen," he said, "stepped forward today when it would have been easier to look away. She didn't have a title to protect her. No shield, just a conscience." Naomi's eyes widened. "This airline needs more people like her," Julian continued. "People who hesitate, but still choose to do the right thing." For a moment, Naomi froze. Then slowly, passengers began to clap. Not all at once, but one by one. It wasn't loud. It was deliberate, earned. In 2C, a middle-aged woman stood and placed her hand over her heart. "Thank you," she said, voice cracking. A man in 3D stood next. "I didn't say anything earlier," he admitted. "I should have. I've been silent in moments like this before, too many times." Julian looked at him, nodded. "It's not about who stood first. It's about who stands now." A ripple moved through the rows. Passengers began rising, not in protest, not for a round of applause, but in quiet acknowledgement of what had happened, of what they'd allowed to pass, of what they now knew would never sit the same again. Naomi's face turned pink, but her posture straightened. She wasn't hiding anymore. When the last hand lowered and the last nod passed between strangers, the cabin was still again. But this stillness was different. It wasn't the hush of tension, it was the calm of alignment. The kind that follows after a truth long ignored finally finds its voice. Julian returned to his seat without flourish, and for once, no one looked away. 3 days after the incident, a quiet notification appeared on the internal dashboard of every Global Wings employee: pilots, ground crew, call center staff, executives. Live company address, CEO Julian Cross, now streaming. There was no marketing, no dramatic music, just a single still frame. Julian seated alone in a modest conference room, no backdrop, no logo, just a microphone and a black leather notebook. He looked directly into the lens and began. "I won't repeat the story. You've heard enough versions already." He paused. "What I want to talk about isn't what happened to me, but what it revealed about us." The camera didn't cut away. There were no edits. Julian spoke slowly, deliberately. "If your CEO, can be dismissed, belittled, and assumed to not belong, what does that say about how we treat customers who don't have my title, my platform, my privilege?" He let the silence fill the screen. "I don't need your apologies," he continued. "I need your eyes open. Because what happened on Flight 417 wasn't just a personnel issue. It was a culture issue. And culture is built by what we ignore, what we excuse, and what we enforce." Over 31,000 employees watched live. Another 6,000 replayed the video before midnight. Julian then held up his notebook. "This is the Skyline Protocol," he said. "Not a reaction, a direction. We rebuild from here." He outlined every step: mandatory bias training, the anonymous reporting platform, the crew audit. But it was the final announcements that stirred the deepest response. "Effective immediately," he said. "Naomi Chen is being promoted to Director of Cabin Culture, a new role with direct advisory power to the executive team." In a nearby base lounge, Naomi stared at the screen, stunned, tears welling. "And Gregory Stone," Julian continued, "has accepted our offer to return, not as a pilot, but as a senior consultant for leadership development and crew ethics training. His voice will help guide our future." In a quiet apartment in Chicago, Gregory sat alone on his couch, hands trembling slightly, jaw clenched. Not with anger, but awe. After 2 decades of silence, he was being heard. Julian closed the notebook and leaned forward. This isn't about making a moment look good. It's about making sure it never happens again. He ended the stream without fanfare, but the effect rippled. Departments across the company began posting internal pledges. Crew bases started informal conversations on culture. Even junior staff felt empowered to speak where they used to stay quiet. The rebuild had begun, not with fireworks, but with focus. And the quiet conviction of a man who knew that leadership doesn't mean walking ahead. It means lifting others when no one else will. The airport was loud. Families reuniting, luggage wheels spinning, overhead announcements cutting through the air like static. But in the center of the chaos stood Julian Cross, still as stone, eyes scanning the crowd near Gate 12. Then he saw her, Elena Cross, his daughter, walking toward him with her usual stride, measured, alert, purposeful. She wore a gray blazer over jeans, earbuds still hanging around her neck, a carry-on trailing behind her. When their eyes met, she didn't smile right away. She just walked faster. They embraced in silence. No words, just the kind of hug that says, "I saw what you did, I felt it, and I'm proud." Julian pulled back first, gently squeezing her shoulder. "Let's walk," he said. They moved slowly through the concourse, weaving past travelers, stepping around strollers, watching the world move on as if it hadn't just witnessed a cultural pivot at 30,000 feet. Julian spoke first, his voice quiet. "It still hurts." Elena glanced sideways. "The incident?" "No," he said. "The fact that I expected it. The fact that I wasn't even surprised." She didn't respond right away. Instead, she took his hand, something she hadn't done since she was 12, and held it as they walked. When they reached the observation window, Julian stopped. Outside, a Global Wings aircraft taxied slowly across the tarmac, gleaming under the afternoon sun. The same livery, the same logo. But to him, it looked different. Elena followed his gaze. "People are talking," she said. "Articles, think pieces, headlines. You're being called the quiet CEO who disrupted his own airline." Julian chuckled softly. Disruption wasn't the goal. "No," she agreed, "but impact was." He nodded, then added, "Leadership doesn't need volume. It needs vision, and sometimes just presence." Elena looked at him, eyes soft. "That what you told the board?" He shook his head. "No, that's what I told myself when I sat in that seat and let myself be treated like a stranger in my own house." She squeezed his hand tighter. They stood in silence for a long beat. Then the intercom announced pre-boarding for his flight. Julian turned, adjusted the strap on his satchel, and looked back at Elena. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For reminding me why we fight for things that no one else sees until it's too late." She smiled, finally. "You didn't fight. You endured. That's harder." He nodded, gave her a brief hug, and walked toward the gate. As the plane ascended minutes later, Julian sat again in 4C, glancing once at the window, watching clouds part beneath the wing. He didn't smile. He didn't cry. He just breathed out, a long, silent breath, like something inside him had finally settled. And as the aircraft leveled out, so did he. The system hadn't changed overnight. But this cabin had changed color, and the sky would remember.